In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Francoise Cavada-Blanco. She is a marine ecologist from Venezuela who is also the co-chair of the IUCN Coral Specialist Group. In this episode, we talk about the importance of corals and coral reefs in tackling the climate crisis and its importance in the global economy. Tune in to listen more and do not forget to share and subscribe to the Think Wildlife podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Francoisa. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast talking about corals and all the work you have done.
Thank you, Anish, for inviting me and having me here.
So, what got you interested in working with corals?
Well, it was part curiosity and part, honestly, just fear at the same time. When I was an undergraduate, I studied a licenciature back in Venezuela, that's South America, in marine biology. And I work as part-time in a scuba diving operator. Started by, helping cleaning the equipment until I progressed as a snorkeling guide. And, well, obviously, we dove in some marginal reef, actually, not in a very well state, to be honest. But at that time, that was everything I knew. And for me, that looked wonderful. And obviously, as I spent more time underwater, I became more curious about why the things that I was looking at were like that, the interaction between the organisms. And obviously, being a marine biologist, I thought, okay, I really would like to work in coral reef. But at that time, the small university where I was studying, nobody worked with coral reef there. So instead, my project was focused on the microalgae that are associated with corals in their mucus. So that was the way I was able to start working with corals. Basically, because there was no coral expert at my university, only microbiologists and plankton experts. So anyways, I found a way to still have a little bit of corals in there. And that's how I started.
So, what exactly is a coral and what classifies as a coral reef?
Well, a coral is part rock, part animal, and part plant, depending on how you look at it. Corals are marine invertebrates. They are within the class Anthozoa. They are small polyps that can be colonial, can be all together forming one colony, or can be solitary. And there can be considered part rocks because many species of corals excrete their own skeleton, and when the living organisms die, they leave behind this calcium carbonate structure that is like a rock. They can be considered also plants, depending on how you look at it, in a very lay way, because they live with a small microalgae called zooxanthellae. These zooxanthellae are actually living inside the polyps of many coral species, and they photosynthesize. So many of these coral, which are the ones that form coral reef, and I'm going to get to the coral reef in just a minute, require the same things that a plant, for example, having enough light so that their little partners, the zooxanthellae, can actually do photosynthesis. A coral reef is a reef that is built by coral. And the definition of reef is ample, to be honest. So a reef is anything that provides more complexity in comparison to the adjacent seascape or topography. And there can be biogenic reef, which are reefs that are made up by living organisms, and coral reefs are part of that group. There could be also oyster reefs and so forth.
So, where are the corals distributed across the world?
Most reef building corals, so those corals that grow relatively big and provide a very big framework through their skeletons, are distributed mostly in tropical and subtropical areas in shallow waters, but you can also find cold water corals, you can also find mesophotic reefs, and you can also find deep water coral. It's just that most of the deep water corals, for example, don't build reefs like the ones we are used to seeing in DTV or magazines, these beautiful, colorful, biodiverse, tropical coral reefs.
What makes corals such an important taxa?
Several things, and the most important one is precisely the fact that they are able to build those reefs, that they are the responsible for creating this complexity and therefore providing habitats. That habitat and the many different characteristics that are available in a coral reef provide opportunity for many organisms to be able to live together, and therefore that enhances biodiversity. More biodiverse systems are obviously more robust, but also provide a myriad of ecosystem services from which we humans benefit. And I think the most direct one, or the easiest for any audience to see, is through, for example, fisheries in coral reef areas.
Climate change is known to cause coral bleaching. So, what exactly is coral bleaching and why is it an issue?
Well, coral bleaching, the process of bleaching, is when these corals that live with these their partners, the zooxanthellae, get really stressed and they expel the zooxanthellae. So they lose the zooxanthellae. And this is important because zooxanthellae, through photosynthesis, are able to give the coral host a lot of the nutrition that it needs, to keep alive, to reproduce, to fight against diseases or infections. So imagine that you can only eat one type of food, or you are in your house and are unable to leave your house, and the nutrition is only provided by a personal chef that lives in your house, and that chef just all of the sudden leaves and you are unable to get food from any other source. So the coral sees itself weakened, obviously, because it's not getting the nutrition it requires. The name bleaching is because the different colors that you can see in corals are in fact provided by the zooxanthellae. So when they lose the zooxanthellae, they look all white or see-through in many cases. So what you are seeing is the skeleton, that color. That is why it is called bleaching. Many corals, if they are impaired, nutrition impaired for long periods of time, can die, the whole colonies, or they can die partially, part of the colony can die. And what is driving mass bleaching in terms of not only the spatial area in which the bleaching has an effect, but also increasing the frequency at which these mass bleaching events occur, is the increase in average sea surface temperature. And that is obviously due to climate change.
Coral mining is also a massive threat. So why exactly are corals being mined so heavily?
Coral mining is an important threat in some areas of the world. So aside from climate change is a global threat, and I would actually put that as the number one threat for coral globally. And then locally, in several areas, there are many other different threats that also affect negatively corals and coral reef. Coral mining is one of them. To be fair, it has decreased globally in time and is mostly driven by the demand for building materials, for souvenirs, and for coral-based compounds, and it destructively removes corals from reef, leading to habitat loss and basically ecosystem imbalance.
So how does agriculture impact corals?
Agriculture can impact coral depending on how well managed the agricultural practices are. So, and this is true for every coastal ecosystem, no, not just coral reef. Everything that can end up in rivers as runoff due to rain will ultimately reach the sea. And in the case of agriculture, the runoff is mostly nutrients that come from the different fertilizers and can also be, aside from nutrients, can be other pollutants and chemicals from chemical pesticides. Both can harm corals. One, the pesticides and other pollutants, obviously, or inorganic pollutants, more directly, so through harmful chemicals. And the nutrients can actually accelerate the growth of both macroalgae and microalgae or plankton, creating something that is known as eutrophication. This can basically deplete the oxygen in the water, ultimately can also decrease the amount of light that corals receive, can overall stress corals because the water quality decreases, and that stress is more energy spent in things that are not growing or reproducing, but trying to cope physiologically with those stressors. And also, it boosts the growth of macroalgae that can outcompete corals.
What are some of the other threats faced by corals?
Well, sadly, corals face many threats. At the top is climate change, and that is because it's global, is of global scope, is increasing, and the effect is widespread. And then localized, we have several different threats. Overfishing is a very important one, because again, it can imbalance several processes within the ecosystem and can remove key species that modulate competitions of corals with other organisms and trigger what is known as phase shift. So can lead one coral reef that is dominated, so the most abundant things that you can see are reef building corals, to one that is dominated by other organisms like macroalgae or octocorals, for example. And they don't provide the same services or the same role that corals do, and that changes the function of the ecosystem. Agriculture and coastal development in general, and finally, mechanical breakage that can come from unsustainable tourism practices and other activities that can just break the coral. For example, mining would be one of those. Also, harmful fishing activities, not just because of the removal of key species like herbivores, but because of the practice itself.
What is being done at a global scale to conserve coral reefs?
Well, at global scale, I think most importantly have been several programs within the United Nations and the International Coral Reef Initiative. Those have been instrumental at a global level in driving conservation initiatives, but also in catalyzing the instances that need to be in place to facilitate action at regional and local level. Most importantly, I believe, is that at national and local level, most of the initiatives in coral conservation that have real impact work at that scale and are implemented at that scale. And there are a myriad of examples, from just monitoring programs that allows to gauge the state of the coral reef and identify priorities and inform higher level indicators like the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, to more active interventions, for example, coral restoration.
So talk about the IUCN Coral Specialist Group.
So the IUCN Coral Specialist Group is part of the Species Survival Commission inside the IUCN. There are over 160, I believe, different specialist groups focusing not only on taxa, but also other important aspects of conservation and conservation practice that also work across all the different taxa-focused specialist groups. And our group focuses on corals, and our group works on assessing the conservation status of coral species in order to provide guidance on effective conservation strategies and advocating for global coral conservation. So we are composed by several expert members from around the world, a group that we are planning to expand this upcoming year. And our work for the IUCN is all voluntary.
So talk about some of the other conservation projects you are involved with.
So my work actually spans various initiatives. During my work at CELECEL, I was a mentor for several young conservationists around the world, and I basically work on their projects, guiding them in both planning and mostly planning and implementing. And those were focused on edge species. Those are species that are evolutionarily distinct. And those included green sea turtles, corals in the Caribbean, corals in the Maldives, several species of sharks and rays in Bangladesh and in Borneo, the giant softshell Asian turtle in India, and also in Ghana. And the last one, I participated at the beginning, at the onset, in Tanzania. Most of my research is honestly focused on how to improve the way we monitor rare species and threatened species so that we have a better picture of their status. There is a lot of work to be done there. And also, how can we blend different techniques and apply multidisciplinary approaches to lessen the cost of certain methods to monitor the species and to have a better comprehension of the links between the ecological side and the social side. So I also focus part of my research in modeling socioecological systems. Helps in assessing the impacts that different management interventions could have, not only on the ecological part or the species or ecosystems, but also on the people that are intrinsically linked to that ecosystem.
So, what have been some of the most prominent challenges you have faced throughout your conservation career?
I think one of the most significant challenges for the conservation sector is long-term funding for projects that require to be long-term, mostly because funding is made available depending on several priorities, and priorities can shift quite quickly at both the national and global level. No, I think that is the most significant challenge for most of the people who work in conservation. In practical terms, at this moment, the most significant challenge for everyone, I would say, is climate change and the pace at which it is progressing and the inability to advance towards the goals that have been agreed. I think the third one, and I think this is also quite important in terms of practice, is balancing local community needs with conservation goals. Cannot meet the local community needs, that impact, I don't think, is going to be a lasting one.
And what have been some of your most memorable moments from your conservation career?
Wow, that's a difficult question. I think this journey has taught me, and it's still going, I'm like in the middle, not at the end. Definitely the importance of interdisciplinary approaches, the power that involving the community has for success in conservation projects, and the need for adaptability in the team, in the projects, and in the community, especially in the face of the environmental challenges we're facing with climate change. I think that the moments that I cherish the most are those in which the people I have mentored are recognized for their achievements. I really, really, really like to teach and to see how my students and the fellows I have mentored and my mentees progress, no, and become really good professionals and start making a difference in the respective areas and countries.
And my final question for you is that how can individuals contribute to coral conservation?
Well, in several ways. I think that most importantly, they need to be mindful on their practices, try to reduce their carbon footprint, number one. Number two, if they live near a coral reef or they go out in vacations to coral reef, be mindful of the chemicals that you're putting in your body and how they can affect different animals and algae when you get into the water. Be mindful of any tourism practices in which you engage. Are they actually run ethically and having the environment in mind? So, for example, avoid using diving operators in which they overcrowd certain diving sites. be a recurrent client for those that have some ethical guidance in practice and communicate that to their clients. I think that most importantly is that we all need to start using our power as voters and reach out to our representative to try to put pressure towards government acting for climate change to avert the worst scenario. I think that is the most significant change that every one of us can do.
So that was the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Nish. I really appreciate the opportunity.